So real quick, I just introduced Robbie a little bit. I think a lot of you know him well already, but he was born in Northern California in a small town called San Anselmo. He went to UC Davis, got his degree, his undergraduate degree in wildlife biology. And after that, he went off and did a whole bunch of really cool field wildlife projects. Got a lot of great experience working for the Forest Service on spotted owl projects. He did a study on wood duck demography. He studied Caspian terns with Oregon State. There's the ding dong. He went to Mexico and did some work on the Sea of Cortez for about a year. And then he came back and did some work, first started working with bioacoustics, coming back, working with spotted owls. And that's how he got some of his bioacoustic experience that led him to Hawaii. He came to Hilo in the TCBES program in 2019 into the Lohe Lab. And he was supported on his work from a Disney grant and from the Crest Award, among other grants that he got. And sorry, you guys. And he's starting his, and his skills are in such high demand. Sorry about that. His skills are in such high demand that he's starting a permanent position tomorrow with Forest Solutions here on Hawaii. And they liked him so much that they just bought him a new Toyota four-wheel drive truck to start off his position with. So that says quite a lot right there, I think. So anyways, today Robbie's going to present his thesis research on a group of Alala that were born in captivity and released to the wild. And he spent hundreds of hours videoing the behavior of these birds in the forest. And so he's going to present some of his results today. So thank you, and take it away, Robbie.
All right. All right, can you guys see that? Okay, so yeah, thank you guys for tuning into my presentation of my thesis work that focused on the vocalizations of captive reared Alala released into Pu'umakala. And before I dive directly into my project, I'm going to give you guys a little background about animal behavior and the cultural transmission of that animal behavior. So the conservation of animal behavior, or ethology, is a rapidly growing topic in the conservation world. It's a vital aspect to address when approaching conservation, not only at a local scale, but globally too. Despite this fact, there are very few studies that tie animal behavior into management plans. And behavioral data is extremely valuable in predicting the impacts of further anthropogenic disturbance on animal populations. Understanding how humans disrupt the breeding, dispersal, learning of foraging techniques, and movements and other behaviors is critical knowledge that needs to be addressed in order for our conservation projects to become more successful. And behavior is usually the main way that animals interact with their environments, both physically and socially. So conserving the variety of ways that animals behave between populations is an extremely important aspect that management needs to consider. And for many animals, vocalizations are an important part of their behavioral and biological processes. So enhancing the monitoring of vocalizations and communications would prove to be very useful and would likely yield extremely valuable data that could easily be translated into conservation projects. Vocalizations of birds is one of the most studied forms of animal communication. And there have been recent studies that indicate that as bird populations decline, song complexity and diversity is reduced. And this trend holds true in many species within Hawaii, such as the extant species of Hawaiian honeycreepers. Vocalizations of oscines like the Alala, parrots, or Pisciticiformes, and hummingbirds or podiformes have both innate and socially learned components of their songs, meaning that there are species-specific communications that are learned directly from their conspecifics. And these can be culturally transmitted from generation to generation. One of the things that makes studying vocalization such a valuable tool in detecting changes in behaviors is that the changes in vocal repertoires can be detected and occur faster than in genetics, due to the ability of vocal information being passed horizontally within generations, as well as vertically or between generations. And this allows for a faster accumulation of changes than what we could see in genetics. These accumulated changes can be passed down culturally, thus rapidly changing the way that these organisms interact with their environment as well as each other. The Alala are highly social and intelligent corvids, and they have very complex and diverse vocalizations that play an integral role in their social behaviors, as well as their culture. They typically mature around 2 to 3 years, and this is when we see the birds pair up. And hopefully, after pairing and hopefully after producing offspring, they can form family groups that are capable of using those complex vocalizations to coordinate a wide variety of behaviors. And due to the Alala's current state of being in captivity, they are particularly susceptible to the erosion of their vocal repertoire. So here's a little timeline of how the Alala got to their current status today. Currently, the entire population of Alala resides in human care, and they were once found throughout the mesic and dry forests of the island of Hawaiʻi. By the 50s, there was an already notable decrease in the areas where the Alala were found, and they were at low numbers due to a variety of factors, including poaching by humans, habitat degradation and loss, disease, and predation by both native and non-native predators. In the 70s, due to a visible sharp decline in their population and range, some birds were brought into human care in the beginnings of the captive breeding program with the goal of wild releases to supplement the declining wild population. By the 90s, only 13 birds were known in the wild, split between Alalā and McCandless Ranch, as well as utilizing the surrounding area of Honaunau. The last wild pair was seen in South Kona in 2002, and they were listed as extinct in the wild in 2004. There have been several release attempts in recent years, both in 2016 and 2017. And by late 2020, the Alala made the extremely hard decision to bring the remaining birds back into captivity. And they're now looking to other release sites, including areas on the island of Maui, where the Io, or the Hawaiian hawk, who's the bird's natural predator, is not present. And the current captive population of the Alala numbers in the 120s. So I studied the vocalizations of 18 captive reared Alala released into Pu'umaka'ala Natural Area Reserve. This group of Alala were part of a larger group of 27 captive reared birds that were released in 3 separate cohorts, with 11 released in 2017, 10 released in 2018, and 6 released in 2019. In total, there was 16 males and 11 females released in the wild, and they were released as juveniles between the ages of 15 and 18 months and matured to adults in the wild. So in order to monitor the ongoing activity of the birds and the state of their reintroduction in the wild, the birds were monitored daily. And along with the active monitoring of the birds, things such as forest habitat, predator control, surveillance of the diseases were also taken into account when selecting the area for their release. And in order to eventually establish a self-sustaining wild population of Alala, it will also require that captive reared released Alala acquire social behaviors that are necessary for the wild. And according to the US Fish and Wildlife Service, the initial reintroduction in the 90s failed for many reasons, but the loss of behaviors associated with predator avoidance, attracting a mate, establishing a territory, and courtship likely played a large role. So using their vocalizations and observational data from the videos allowed us to understand the development of successful behaviors. And this is how we were able to study these birds' assimilation back into the wild. So there has been research comparing vocalization of the past wild population and the captive one, with Ann Tanimoto Johnson's research in 2017 doing just this. She found that the acoustic information being passed from generation to generation within captivity is different than the previous wild population. And her research highlighted that captive and wild birds had a similar diversity of vocalizations and had significant overlap of many of the same types of calls. But the frequency of the unique call types associated with different behaviors differed heavily. And this information leads to thinking that the behaviors of the captive Alala that are being learned both vertically and horizontally differed from the original wild population. And the image from Tanimoto et al. 17 represents the different pairs from previous wild and aviary pairs and their vocalizations. The top row is the pair name, and the bottom row are the vocalizations described. The lines are connecting the vocalizations that are in each pair's vocal repertoire. You guys see that? So building on Ann Tanimoto Johnson's work, we set forth to understand this new captive reared wild release population. The goal of our project was to use vocalizations as a way to monitor how these captive reared birds were adapting to the wild, and if they are developing appropriate behaviors in order to succeed outside of human care. Repertoire size and diversity are important indicators for success of wild birds, and it has been shown that birds with a larger repertoire size and higher diversity have increased fitness. So with this information, we were looking into the different factors that influence the size and diversity of vocalization. And these factors include social connectedness, which is the bird's connection to the other birds that were released. So this is an important factor to consider because of the Alala's life history. They spend a lot of time in juvenile groups and then potentially could eventually form family groups. So understanding how each individual is connected to all of the other birds is crucial information in understanding how the vocal repertoire is developed. And pair status was also included, and it's based on whether or not a bird has a partner. So we predicted that the bird's pair status would have a large influence on the repertoire size and diversity because of the presence of calls that are associated with being paired, such as courtship or territorial calls, as well as those to the sex of the bird was also considered, because in many species, we see males making a significantly larger amount of vocalizations, but with the Alala, we see both females and males vocalizing. So we want to understand if these things are potential predictors of the size and diversity of their repertoire. Along with looking into the factors that influence the repertoire size and diversity, another aspect of this study ties in observational data and how connected the birds are to the group at the time of each vocalization made. And this can allow us to see how the social life of each Alala shapes the types of behaviors that these individuals exhibited. The data sets that made this project possible came from two separate avenues, with the first being from vocalizations and their associated behaviors via video, and the second was observational. The observational data was vital to our ability to understand how the released birds were interacting with each other. And both data sets were collected by the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance tracking team, as well as myself. The birds were monitored for the entirety of the project, and data points were collected whenever a bird was seen. Video recordings of the Alala were taken between 6:45 a.m. and 4 p.m., attempting to capture a wide variety of vocalizations along with their associated behaviors. And birds were ID'd by their unique color band combinations on their legs, as well as using a VHF transmitter to allow for telemetry tracking of the birds. In order to use the video data set, the first thing we wanted to do was classify our songs. And this was necessary to allow us to get a total repertoire size as well as the diversity for each individual. The difference between size and diversity are important to distinguish. So the total repertoire size is the total number of unique call types. And the repertoire diversity is the distribution of those call types or the evenness of them. And we did this by cataloging each one of the vocalizations and using multiple programs. The first one we used was Raven. So I took the original video file and changed it to a WAV file that could be uploaded onto Raven. And Raven provides us with a spectrogram, which is a visualization of the vocalization. While going through Raven to analyze the acoustic characteristics of the vocalization, I was simultaneously watching the video in order to collect other information and clues about what each vocalization meant. So basically, I was using the video as a behavioral context of how each vocalization was made, and all the vocalizations were selected individually, taking this behavioral context into account. So we made sure to standardize the behavior classification method by comparing the vocalizations from past and current studies of Alala vocalizations at the Lohe Lab. Classifying the vocalizations was done by comparing both the sounds of the calls as well as the visual picture produced by the spectrogram. As expected, there were definitely multiple call types that fit into each category, and this led me to create a library specific to the wild birds solely from this release project from 2017 to 2020. A major part of the value of using videos was the ability to classify each call and associate that with behaviors that were seen with the vocalization. So the behavioral categories that we included were territorial broadcasts, social contact calls, close quarter contact calls, submissive calls, aggression calls, alarms, courtship, and miscellaneous calls were when behaviors couldn't be classified. So here's an example of how I got the vocalization data.
Okay, 957. This is red middle white white.
Okay, so as you guys can imagine, Alala can fly and I can't. So a lot of the data was me chasing them while I'm on the ground and they're comfortably in the trees. But I eventually catch up, and here's
Okay, that's white white. White white is to the left.
all right, so those are good examples of close quarter contact calls. And so this was an example of a female making close quarter contact calls to a male. And it was a little before, but it was right after her getting allopreened. And that's a pretty common time that we'd see these vocalizations. Another vocalization video that I included was, and this is,
This is awesome.
So this second video is one of the paired males making territorial broadcasts from him and his partner's territory. And I don't know if you guys could hear that in the video, but after spending so much time out there and following these birds and getting to see cool stuff like this, you get pretty stoked. So I was pretty stoked in the video. Ooh.
Okay.
So just adding on to these cool videos that I have with my presentation, I'll show you guys another one. So here you can see that multiple types of calls can be used sequentially. So this meant for classifications that we couldn't just label one video as having one type of call. So we had to make individual judgments about each specific call. And a great help in classifying this massive amount of calls after making the individual Raven selection was done using a program called Koe. So Koe is an internet program that constructs ordinations based on specific acoustic features from each vocalization. And in order to frame our ordinations without biasing them based on the distance from the bird or individual variation or the volume, we didn't include acoustic features of the vocalization that involve duration, power, amplitude, or harmonics. These parameters that we set were meant to allow for a more accurate assessment of the individual calls, and all of these calls were put into ordination images. So here's an example of an ordination image. This specific ordination represents every single call that I categorized from the beginning of the release in 2017 up until my last video I took on July 10th of 2020. And each point represents a single vocalization, and it represents the acoustic characteristics associated with that vocalization. And this ordination allowed for a more objective way of classifying the thousands of calls that it looked through by clustering more similar calls together. So although this program didn't work as well with the individual call classification as we originally hoped due to the spectrograms not being as detailed as those on Raven, being able to see the vocalizations in the ordination context was very advantageous. So these ordinations helped allow me to see the spread of vocalizations, and it did a pretty decent job of clustering these similar vocalizations together. Using these ordinations allowed me to speed up the process of categorizing each call into individual call types and behavioral categories. We were also interested in things like connectedness of each individual to the group and their ranking in terms of their aggressive behaviors and how these things were important. And for this, we use the observational data. So this video fortunately had the sound cut out due to my excitement of getting decent footage of nest building. But this is a good example to show that my videos were not only collecting data for associating behaviors with calls, but you can see two birds interacting in a unique way. And this is an example of observational data. So here you can see the male moving a stick to start building a nest. And like we see in many couples, both human and Alala, he put the stick in the wrong place. So the other bird is going to move the stick into the right place. And this type of observational data was used to help build the social network. The social network data was built on the observational data, and it was built on the video, or it was built on observations of taking different interactions between birds. The use of this social network allowed us to understand how these birds were connected to each other and how those connections changed over time. This added a lot of unique insights and information to the development of the behaviors in these captive reared birds. And in order to use this robust data set, we divided the social behaviors documented into three separate behavior categories. So we have affiliative betweenness, pair bonding betweenness, and outward aggression. Affiliative betweenness included behaviors that involve just tolerating another bird's presence. So basically non-directed behaviors, things like co-feeding and co-sitting. Pair bonding betweenness included behaviors that involve direct courtship type behaviors, so allo-feeding, allo-breeding, and breeding solicitation. And outward aggression is pretty self-explanatory. It's one bird showing direct aggression to another or others. So chasing, displacing, or just overall being a bully are good examples of this. It was important to differentiate between the different behavior types because of what each specific metric measures. Being able to quantify how each individual interacts with one another based on tolerance, pairing interest, or aggression allowed for a deeper understanding of how Alala vocal repertoire is shaped. And after 3 years of collecting, organizing, categorizing, and then analyzing the calls from the 18 captive reared released Alala, we're able to obtain 10,425 usable vocalizations with an average of 38 videos taken of each bird. And on average, those birds were observed for 579 days, and we captured a total of 43 unique call types with an average of about 20 unique calls per individual. The observational data set was the foundation of the social network. And this data set was collected over the entire span of the project. And in total, we collected 989 observations of outward aggression, 1,701 pair bonding behavior observations, and 8,709 observations of affiliative behavior. And after organizing these data sets and preparing the data to be used in different ways, we dove into the 3 questions that I had originally set out to answer. So my first question was to look into the factors that influence the Alala repertoire size and diversity. So we defined repertoire size by the total overall count of call types made by an individual, and the diversity by the evenness of the spread of the call types used. In order to find the influence on repertoire size and alpha diversity, which is the diversity between individuals, we used a linear model. To identify the factors that influence the repertoire beta diversity, or the diversity between groups or categories of birds, a permanova was used, and it was measured using a Bray-Curtis measure of similarity. We included the bird's paired status, the sex of the bird, and the affiliative and pair bonding metrics as measures of connectedness. And I predicted that bird's pair status would have a strong influence on the Alala repertoire size and diversity due to the presence of them making calls that were associated with being paired, such as courtship or territorial defense. I also predicted that birds that were more closely associated with a larger amount of birds would have a higher vocal repertoire due to them communicating and interacting more closely with more birds. So we found that vocal repertoire size was generally not influenced by affiliative betweenness, pair bonding betweenness, sex, or the paired status. We also found that alpha diversity was not influenced by the sex or the connectedness to other birds measured by the affiliative or pair bonding betweenness. However, the repertoire alpha diversity did show that juveniles that died before adulthood had significantly lower diversity when compared to the paired or even unpaired adults. We did find more significance when looking at beta diversity, or remember the diversity compared between groups. Affiliative betweenness, which again measures how you're affiliating with birds, so spending time co-sitting or co-feeding, influenced the beta diversity. And here you can see on the left side of the graph, there's a large amount of pair birds with a very low affiliative score. So pair bonding score didn't influence the beta diversity. So remember, pair bonding score represents the behaviors that relate to courtship. Beta diversity was influenced by the sex of the bird. As you could see, there's a pretty good separation between males and females, separated by color. And beta diversity was also influenced by the paired status of the bird. With the paired and unpaired birds, you can see a little bit of separation, as only 2 of the paired females fell on the right side of the graph with the unpaired individuals. And my second question was also split into 2 parts, comparing both the size and the diversity of their vocal repertoire. And it was, is the repertoire size and diversity as a juvenile an indicator of what vocalizations will be exhibited as an adult? So in order to answer this question, we used a linear mixed model with a logit link function, and we calculated each bird's repertoire size and diversity separately for the juvenile and adult life stages based on the vocalizations that they're making at this time. And only the birds that survived to adulthood were included in this analysis. So in each of the models, we included the bird's life stage and their paired status, as well as the interaction between those two variables as a fixed factor. We conducted a post hoc analysis for significant interactions, and I expected that the juveniles with a larger and more diverse vocal repertoire would have a larger and more diverse vocal repertoire as an adult. The relationship between the size of the bird's repertoire and their eventual paired status was somewhat surprising. We found a significant interaction between the life stage and paired status for the size of their repertoire. And we also found that birds who remained unpaired in their adult stage had little change in their repertoire size. Birds who eventually paired up had a higher vocal repertoire size as juveniles and actually saw a significant decrease in their repertoire size as they matured into adults. Our look into the juvenile and adult vocal repertoire diversity relationship also helped paint this cool take home. So similar to repertoire size, we found a significant interaction between life stage and paired status. And the unpaired birds saw no statistically significant change between their repertoire as they matured. Birds who eventually paired up saw a significant increase in diversity once they matured and became paired adults. And repertoire size and diversity for the Alala that remained unpaired didn't differ between their juvenile and adult life stages, where in contrast, the Alala that formed a pair had a larger vocal repertoire size as a juvenile than as an adult. However, the diversity of calls in their adult phase of the paired individuals was greater than during their juvenile phase. These differences in how the repertoire diversity and the total size changed gave us very interesting results. So it's entirely possible that the juvenile Alala see the larger vocal repertoire size as an attractive trait, thus making them more likely to pair up immediately after their juvenile stage. And potentially, once paired up, the Alala use less total call types, but use a larger variety of calls more frequently. And these calls that they used more frequently were associated with territorial defense, aggression, and pair bond maintenance. So it's feasible to think that the large repertoire size attracted their mate, and then they honed in on the important vocalizations that were more important for maintaining their territory, as well as the relationship with their partner. And my third question is, what factors can predict the occurrence of calls within different behavioral categories? So it's important to note for this question that all the vocalizations were categorized based on what life stage the bird was at when the call was made. So for example, if a juvenile made a contact call and then paired up as a paired adult made another contact call, those two calls would be separated by the different life stages. And for this question, we used the social network data and analyzed all the different metrics that we introduced earlier. So affiliative betweenness, pair bonding betweenness, and outward aggression. These metrics are designed to understand the connectedness of each individual to the group. So in order to use these data, I had to consolidate the original 8 behavioral categories down into 5 separate categories. So close quarter contact calls were reclassified into the submissive category. And this was due to the vast majority of them being within pairs from female to male while getting alloprene. And miscellaneous calls were removed from this because of the difficulty of classifying them on an ordinal scale. And courtship calls were also removed because there are only 12 calls that were classified into this behavioral category. These combined classifications made an ordinal data set ranking the behaviors from 1 to 5 least to most dominant behaviors. And the response variables that were included for this question were outward aggression, affiliative betweenness, pair bonding betweenness, sex, and paired status. And since the data set captured was ordinal, we ran a categorical linear mixed model, which is best suited for this type of ordinal data. And the CLMM assessed whether or not the specific response variables can determine which behavioral categories would be exhibited by an individual. So here we have a chart showing the spread of behaviors based on the life stage of the bird. So SU is submissive, SC is a contact call, AL represents alarms, AG represents aggressive calls, and TB represents territorial broadcasts. So as you can see, there's definitely a correlation between the life stage you're in, or the life stage the Alala are in, and the types of calls that they make. So when compared to the juvenile and unpaired birds, paired birds make a larger amount of calls. Over half were associated with alarm, aggressive calls, and territorial broadcasts. It was also surprising to me to see how aggressive the widowed birds were. So apparently losing your mate makes you much more aggressive. When looking at behavioral metric or the behavior metrics, we found some more thought-provoking results. So contrary to what I had originally thought, the birds that had a lower affiliation score, or ones that socially interacted with fewer birds, had a higher likelihood of using more aggressive and more territorial calls. So if an individual exhibited affiliative behaviors like co-sitting or co-feeding with less birds, they were more likely to be aggressive. And we typically saw a lower pair bonding score associated with aggression and territorial calls as well. Along with being more likely to use dominant vocalizations, birds with a lower pair bonding score were more likely to be paired. This is a little confusing, as a higher pair bonding score is if they showed these pair bonding type behaviors with multiple other birds. So a lower score just meant they showed them with less birds. So if a bird focused and showed these pair bonding behaviors with less birds, they were more aggressive than birds that exhibited behaviors like allopreening with a large number of birds. Birds that had a higher outward aggression score or showed more aggressive or aggression were more likely to show vocalizations that were associated with being a dominant bird. And this is not unexpected, as we see this in many other species, that individuals that show more aggressive behaviors are more likely to be dominant birds. And the Alala are no exception to this rule. More aggression typically points to more dominant behavior, and hopefully more pairing and eventual reproduction. We also saw a very cool connection with the social network metrics and the types of calls exhibited with the Alala. We found that paired birds had a lower affiliation score, a lower pair bonding score, and a higher level of outward aggression when compared to their unpaired counterparts. Juveniles tended to be all over the map when it came to this, as juveniles who ended up paired or unpaired were all included in that juvenile category. And widowed birds, as you saw in the life stage image, showed a large amount of aggression to other birds, but they also seemed to have a little bit of a higher pair bonding score as well as affiliative score. So the key things to take away from this study are that the Alala that formed pair bonds had a larger repertoire size as juveniles than the birds that did not pair up. And the diversity of that repertoire grew as they matured. There were significant differences between the unpaired and paired birds when comparing them at both their life stages. And birds that were less affiliated with the group of other birds were more likely to show aggression and territorial behavior. The results of this study point to juvenile repertoire size and the connectedness to other birds as good indicators for researchers of the likelihood of pairing success. This was a longitudinal study conducted over a 3-year period, collecting thousands of calls. And this large data set allowed me to link specific vocalizations with their associated behaviors to life stages and social connectivity of the Alala, and this has not been done before. Combining these data with the social network metrics helped us understand how these social dynamics influenced calls that were vocalized. Identifying key elements in a juvenile's repertoire size and diversity associated with important behaviors is a huge step in understanding the transition periods in their lives. And being able to identify behaviors by vocalizations allows us to possibly predict the likelihood of which birds would be more likely to pair up quickly. And this is a relatively new tool that could allow for improvement on the selection of birds for success in the wild. The use of bioacoustic technology to extract individuality information has been used in many projects with birds, such as singing honeyeaters, great spotted kiwis, tawny owls, and greenback flycatchers. But they're mainly being used as census monitoring methods. None of these studies looked at associating behaviors with these vocalizations. They were mainly being used as overall population monitoring studies or getting presence-absence information about a species in a specific area. Our study looked directly at associating behaviors with vocalizations, and this allowed us to look at how Alala behavior was being influenced by a variety of factors. Collecting behavioral data across the juvenile stage and into adulthood has provided better insights than just studying single life stages individually. Knowledge of the way that vocal behaviors transition over a life stage continuum can contribute to conservation outcomes if those behaviors provide insight into a population's response to different actions. For example, vocal behaviors may signal habitat quality or changes in that quality. And the habitat should support not just the species, but also support behaviors that promote the species thriving in that area. Evaluating the effectiveness of a habitat upgrade may mean detecting the presence of juveniles with a larger vocal repertoire size over time following a conservation action, like ungulate fencing or the removal of non-native predators. So just generally talking about the Alala now. So the Alala has had tons of money put in their recovery, especially over the last 30 years. And basically anything we can do to improve the success of the program could be extremely valuable to the wide range of agencies that have had different levels of involvement in the recovery of the Alala. And this information should have real concrete ways in which it could help the success of captive reared released Alala, as well as their future offspring, potentially saving tons of money for these agencies as well. And this work provides another tool in our toolbox to try and save this bird in both the pre and post-release aspects of the process. So we could pre-screen birds and their vocal repertoire for identifying which birds to release, as well as using the change of their repertoire over time as a way to monitor their development in the wild. And in the overall broad scheme of releasing captive reared animals to the wild, this information could prove to be very useful after identifying the immediate issues that cause the animal's population decrease in the first place. So historically speaking, releasing captive reared animals to the wild has not been all that successful. Fortunately, there are successes such as the black-footed ferret, the golden lion tamarin, and the California condor. And hopefully we will be adding the Alala to this list very shortly. And I believe that if we put to use all our tools that we have available, learn from our mistakes, address the problems of past release failures, that the Alala will eventually proliferate across Maui as well as Hawaiʻi Island. So I couldn't end this talk with only showing 3 videos. So here's another cool video. So before I thank the individuals who helped me, I'd like to give a shout out to the Disney Fellowship, NSF's CREST Grant, and the W.T. Yoshimoto Foundation. You guys helped me finish grad school without accruing massive debt. And without you guys, I would likely be in a huge financial hole. So thank you guys. Along with those organizations that funded me, I have a ton of people who helped me with this project, and I hope you guys appreciate my thank yous. First, I'd like to thank the San Diego Zoo tracking team for helping me collect all this data and sharing a lot of information with me. And I'd like to say that a lot of you guys didn't just help me with the fieldwork aspect, but you guys also had a major influence on my time before and during the beginning part of grad school. You guys all made me feel super welcome here and helped me get settled in really quickly. And I'm super grateful for you guys. I'd like to thank my committee for supporting me through this project, dealing with all my questions, editing a bunch of my drafts, and hopefully eventually passing me. I'd like to thank Pat, my advisor, for taking a chance on me and accepting me into this lab, and then putting me out in the field where I belong. I definitely wouldn't have been able to get through this program without you, without your help. Allison Greger, thank you for the social network data. That was a huge undertaking. And obviously this project would not be here without your efforts. And I'd also like to thank you for reshaping my paper multiple times and getting it where it needs to be. I'd like to thank my roommate, Amanda, for helping me stay on track, editing a bunch of my stuff, and motivating me to be a better student and professional. And I'd like to specifically thank Christina. Can't really see you in my screen, but I don't think I'd be able to get over any of the hurdles, let alone all the hurdles that got thrown at me without your help. And I can't really express how thankful that I was that you were here at my grad school experience, especially because I never really had a lot of academic mentors in my educational path. So the amount that you went out of your way to help me was unreal, and I can't thank you enough. And then lastly, I'd like to thank my mom and dad. All your guys' sacrifices you guys made for me and Megan allowed us to have the opportunities to do stuff like this. And I definitely don't think that dad or I would ever thought I would have gone to grad school, let alone finish it. So finally, after a bunch of schooling, I'm hopefully done, finished, and ready to get back into the field. Yeah, that's it, guys.